And welcome to NASIG's Autumn Day 3. It's our last day. They'll be put in the chat, but please notice the NASIG Code of Conduct. And today's committee members are tech support is Jessica, and chat moderator is Jeremy. And my name is Deborah Gold, and I'll be the moderator today. And let us know in the chat if you need anything or have any issues. And if you have any questions for the speakers, please add them to the Q&A. And this is just an overview of today's schedule, Eastern Time for those of us that are not in Eastern Time. And also don't forget that there are the pre-recorded sessions, 16 of them. And our first up for today is Learning as we go, the realities of authenticate. So we're just going to move this so I can see it. Of authentication technology for librarians by Zhaneille Green and Abby Wickes.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop sharing and give you the yes.
Okay. Can you see everything as expected? Great. My name's Abigail Wickes, and I'm the e-resources management librarian at Duke University Libraries, and I'm presenting with my colleague Zhaneille Green, e-access librarian. So thank you so much for attending. Here's an overview for this session. We'll start with some baseline terminology, then we'll talk through Duke-specific authentication and how we got started developing our workflows. We'll discuss nuances of managing IP and SSO authentication and details on what we've learned and documented along the way. Last, we'll share some takeaways for you, including go-to troubleshooting steps, advice for establishing your own workflows, and resources we've found helpful. When Zhaneille and I were preparing this presentation, we realized we could easily talk about this topic for over an hour. So this is kind of a whirlwind tour, but we're still very excited to share it with you. To get us started, here are some basic definitions for some key concepts. Authentication and authorization are sometimes said interchangeably since they're very closely related. Authentication is specifically information provided to verify your identity, and the details and type of information can vary. A popular example is your driver's license. This has identifying information that verifies who you are, whether it's at the doctor, airport, wherever. Authorization is what you have permission to do once your identity is established. For example, your driver's license provides information on whether you're allowed to buy beer or rent a car. When we say authentication in our presentation, we're almost always using it as shorthand for both authentication and authorization. E-resource licensing refers to legal agreements negotiated between libraries and service providers that may stipulate who can or cannot access e-resources. So licensing can create authentication and authorization work, since the library is then obligated to use authentication systems to permit or deny access to different e-resources for different groups. So here is some more detail on what authentication looks like at Duke. We use IP authentication for most e-resources. This is supported by a locally hosted version of EasyProxy, and we also have VPN available. We also have SSO implemented for most of the big publishers, and Zhaneille is working on getting it set up for more and more. Our main user groups are Duke faculty, students, and staff, primarily based in our Durham campus. There are also independent libraries for 3 professional schools. A more unusual group is our partnership with Duke Kunshan University. This group is more likely to have restricted access, leading to a lot of authentication work for us. We also have sponsored accounts that can have restricted e-resource access, and we have a limited number of e-resources available to alumni. Authentication is by and large managed by our IT offices, and the server and system upgrades for our local EasyProxy is managed by our library IT colleagues. Zhaneille and I work in collection services, what is sometimes called technical services in other libraries. While Duke has many systems in place to ensure secure authentication, there was a gap in necessary day-to-day authentication maintenance for e-resources, like manual easy proxy stanza updates, troubleshooting patron problems, managing access restrictions in easy proxy, and making SSO implementations and any access restrictions more routine. We were very lucky to have institutional buy-in for the creation of Zhaneille's position in 2023, and we continue to keep her very busy. Once we had a dedicated person to devote time to learning about these tools and systems and develop proactive approaches for managing them, we had to get started with the deeper learning and workflow development. I went to library school kind of a long time ago, but like many parts of e-resource management, this was not in the curriculum. Zhaneille graduated more recently, and this was also not in her coursework. And this is also a topic we don't see too much in library professional development settings, but I think that's starting to change a little bit. But all of this meant that we had to take a largely self-directed approach and learn through trial and error. So now Zhaneille will talk in more detail about IP and SSO authentication and the workflows we've developed over the past few years.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Abby. So we'll begin by discussing the inner workings of our authentication setups and their nuances. So let's start off with IP authentication. So IP authentication is a method of providing access to our e-resources based on recognizing network information, which is usually your campus's IP addresses and ranges. And what supports that for our off-campus users is proxies. So what is a proxy? A gateway that connects patrons with access to e-resources platforms based on network recognition. So still the sort of like IP setup that we're used to. So the image you see on screen is sourced from OCLC, and it essentially shows how the process works. So the platform URL is usually appended with a proxy string, and the patron's IP is masked or replaced with the institution's very own IP. Next slide, please. So at Duke, we have to manage our IP access not just by our ranges and addresses, but by patron groups. So we use self-hosted Easy Proxy to manage our remote IP access, and we use GitLab to manage our Stanza updates. And within GitLab, we have lots of config files. We organize the stanzas for the different platforms in these config files based on patron groups and subgroups. And for example, we have a config file that restricts resources, particularly for sponsored accounts and Dukunshan accounts. So we have to be creating these different config file that authorizes access or restricts access to these different e-resources. Next slide, please. So here we've listed some advantages and disadvantages for using IP authentication supported by Easy Proxy. And please note that some of the listed pros and cons are universal, but others are colored by the Duke authentication ecosystem and our experiences. For example, the fact that our institution's Easy Proxy is self-hosted. So we wanted to start off by saying it's usually privacy preserving. It masks a patron's IP. Of course, internal, IT and networking can see a patron's IP address or information, but that is internal. It supports remote access. It is reliable and widely used and supported by most vendors. And even if it isn't, I'm sure a lot of librarians can speak to having to spin up their own stanzas. There's also great customer support from OCLC Easy Proxy, and it's relatively easy to provision access depending on your institutional needs and whatever restrictions you might have to implement. Also, it supports the collection of our usage data that is used in more collection services work, like, acquisitions and renewing e-resources. Also, we have very supportive user community, as can be seen from the Easy Proxy listserv. So some disadvantages is that IP authentication is very location-based. You're either on-site or you are supported by Easy Proxy or VPN. Secondarily, IP authentication is susceptible to external changes like bot attacks, because unfortunately, proxy IPs can look like bots because it's all of our patrons coming from one IP address. And especially with vendors beefing up their web security, that is an issue that might cause some like access problems. Secondly, we have malicious players who might engage in web scraping and mass downloads, and sometimes it can be easier for these malicious players to hide behind IP. And we might have unexpected IT changes, such as IP changes at an organization, or if there are any changes in how you provision IP to your library or to your institution, you might have to go through the laborious process of updating your IP addresses with vendors. Then lastly, we have maintenance. There might have to be manual updates, which we do in several complex ways and in different config files. And lastly, there might be vendor or user error risk, like platform migration, URL changes, saving a proxied link and then having that link change information. Steps like that can affect how IP authentication fails or gets broken. Next slide, please. Now we'll move on to discussing single sign-on authentication. Next slide. So single sign-on, SSO, is an authentication method that allows a patron to use a set of credentials, usually for us, institutional emails and passwords to access multiple platforms. And most of the times, this process is underpinned or supported by a protocol called SAML, which is Security Assertion Markup Language. It is the standard that facilitates SSO by managing the authentication and authorization process. So the reason why I pulled out SAML, it is not the only protocol that can facilitate SSO, but it is the one mainly used in academia. Other protocols are OAuth or OpenID. And what usually happens is that SAML sends an assertion to confirm a patron's identity, and that is usually transmitted over the internet, over a browser, via browser redirects. Next slide, please. So we've created a very simplified diagram to introduce you to the SSO authentication process, and it will give you an overview of a patron's user journey starting from your library catalog or from the platform's website. So let's get into some terminology. So universities and academic institutions are usually referred to as IDPs, identity providers. And these are the organizations that hold the digital identities of faculty, student, staff, information, and has the role of authenticating or providing the patron's affiliation with the university. So it's the one that proves that you are actually affiliated with the university. Service providers are SPs, are usually vendors, scholarly platforms, software. They have the information that we're wanting to get to, the articles, databases, streaming media, applications, and they authorize or receive the proof from that, like these specific users are enabled to access it. So starting from the top, we'll run through this fairly quickly. Patrons will navigate to a platform on the library website. And if its default access is SSO, they click on the link to the article and then get prompted to log in with their university credentials and get redirected to the platform where they'll get access to the article. That is not usually the steps that a patron might take. The one that is more usual is the SP initiated process, where a patron is in the wild and wants to access the platform directly. So we'll use like terms so you can follow along more easier. So like a patron goes to JSTOR and they navigate to the login via your institution button and select the university, Duke University. This process sends a assertion or a token to Duke to be like, do you know who this is? The user will see their university login screen and put in their credentials. Duke will respond with their own response or token and send it over the internet to JSTOR. JSTOR will accept this response and the user gets access to the article. And as you can see, if you focus in on 4, 6, and 7, this is where I highlight the process of the two platforms, the SPs and the IDP, communicating with each other. Next slide, please. And finally, I want to dig into how at Duke we learned and internalized the information about this SSO authentication process. So we learned about the existing infrastructure at our institution and beyond. So we started by learning about federations and that we were a part of the In Common Federation, which is a US-based federation. A federation is an organization that established a trusted relationship between two different organizations. So they facilitate the SSO process between, for example, a university and a vendor platform. Usually this only needs one piece of SSO information. Now, the more nuanced and harder aspect is the non-federated authentication. Luckily, we at Duke, our lovely colleagues from the Identity and Access Management Department, IAM, created a website called the Duke Authentication Manager that teaches us more about SSO and helped us facilitated how to set up non-federated authentication. This usually happens when we have to establish relationship with a platform that is not a part of In Common. We have to vet attributes and share SSO information like entity IDs and metadata certificate. Don't worry about these terms. We have a resource sheet at the very end of the presentation. But the main difference you should take away from it is that federated authentication, organizations that are part of a federation only need to share one piece of information because they're already established attributes. It's an established relationship, so everything is, in a sense of the word, already set up. But for non-federated authentication, you have to go through each step yourself. Lastly, we learned about our institutional software and how to communicate with vendors. Here at Duke, we use Grouper, and we at the library use Group Manager. And so we had to go through the learning process to be able to explain our patron groups, which we call policy groups at Duke, to our vendors. Next slide, please, Abby. So some advantages of using SSO authentication: you're not dependent on IP ranges and addresses. You can access the platform from anywhere, and of course from the platform's website. There's personalized access, so research activity can be tied to your digital identity. It's privacy preserving. So a digital identity usually has attributes attached to it. So that's your name, your email address, your affiliation. Are you student or staff? More granular affiliation. Are you from the School of Medicine or Law? And the institution can decide what it's willing to share based on how much privacy it wants to preserve, and also if there's access nuances, such as only law students can access this resource. Also, it can be very user-friendly. This process can seem more familiar and user-centered because it kind of mimics the Google experience. Disadvantages. So institutional capacity, I was hired for my role. If there's not a person doing this work, then existing employees and colleagues would have to like take on the work of like learning and implementing SSO. Also, there's a bit of like a learning curve. We had to learn about our institutional software, Grouper. We had to learn that we were a part of In Common. Abby and I attended the In Common base camp. So there are like steps to a bit of a steep learning curve, depending on what you need SSO to do. Also, vendor capacity. There, it is less widely supported, especially by smaller publishers who do not like have the bandwidth to implement SSO on their end. Also, missing usage data. It's unclear how SSO authentication is logged into usage data when we're so used to collecting usage data via IP through Counter. And next, Abby will share more about our learning process in the next slide.
Yes, so here is a summary of some helpful things we've learned while managing this work. As you've heard, Duke's authentication landscape has many nuances, and creating very detailed internal documentation was critical. We have about 30 pages of procedures documents for workflows for IP, easy proxy, and SSO management. We have a big shared spreadsheet that lists publishers with restricted user group specifics and other oddities like requiring an additional ID and password for authentication. We also have a distilled version of common authentication questions in an e-resource SpringShare FAQ, so patron-facing colleagues can have a quick reference. I want to give a shout out to our library IT colleagues for our meaningful easy proxy error pages. Instead of the generic oops default from easy proxy, we have several different error pages patrons can land on based on the nature of the problem, which helps a lot with troubleshooting. I also want to shout out Zhaneille and our colleagues in identity and access management for creating test accounts with different affiliations so we can truly test what the authentication process is like as part of a different user group like Duke Kunshan or a sponsored account. Developing strong relationships, not always within the library, was also key. Some of our best professional development opportunities were also outside of the library world. More to come on those in a few slides. We've had good luck working with the IP registry with our more complex authentication landscape. We were able to create sub-accounts to make sure the different IP ranges we share are associated with different publishers based on the access restrictions in that publisher's license. So if the license says Duke Kunshan can't access, we don't share the Duke Kunshan campus IPs. So this is not legal advice, but when you're negotiating, you can consider requesting terms related to security or authentication be mutual obligations for both the licensee and the licensor. Mutual trust is how authentication works, so it makes sense for the terms to reflect that. And related, it can be helpful to identify the attributes that your IAM office can work with that preserve patron privacy. Excuse me. Sometimes vendors can't work with certain attributes, so it's also good to have backups in mind. And finally, here are some takeaways that will hopefully, excuse me, help you manage similar work at your institution. Troubleshooting. We don't have time to talk through all these troubleshooting questions, but we hope these will be a helpful takeaway and provide some starting points and next steps if you have to take on IP or SSO authentication troubleshooting at your library.
Hey, so I've created a roadmap to help you reflect on your authentication ecosystem at your institution. Don't worry about taking notes. Not only have we shared this PowerPoint, I've also created a reference sheet. So yay for homework. So the first thing you should do is identify your authentication types. So your patron groups, especially if you have any unique or complex groups, and how licensing might affect access to your library resources. Identify gaps in your ecosystem. How is access managed and by who? How does access technology work in tandem or in conflict with each other on a platform or for different user groups? Manage your access nuances, like note your affiliated institutions. What are their specific access or security needs? Do these needs affect authentication? And is access consistent across authentication types or across platforms? Also, document institutional knowledge, both for your department, your front-facing library colleagues, and for new hires. And if you have like the bandwidth, also LibGuides for students. Plan for the future by selecting concepts or tools that will support your authentication setup. For example, my plan is learning more about Easy Proxy admin tools, using Python to manage Easy Proxy updates and proactively monitor access and access failures. Also, to develop preferred licensing terms for authentication, particularly identifying preferred attributes to release by default. Also, remember to pace yourself. Your plan can and should span months. Remember to eat the elephant one bite at a time. Our achievements mentioned earlier, like our extensive authentication documentation, our FAQs, our built relationships, happened over time. Next slide. So finally, we have listed a few resources on this slide that you'll learn something new or refresh your memory. And that will be it for our presentation. Thank you for joining us today. We're happy to take questions now, and we'll share our contact information for future reference.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Are there any questions? I don't see any in the Q&A. Does anyone want to raise their hand and have any questions? John.
See if I can make all this work. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
I just had one question, please. And sounds like you got a lot of management overhead for resource access. And I was just wondering, I mean, since you're building trusted connections using both federated and IP-based access, do you ever consider jumping from Easy Proxy to Open Athens? And I guess I'll just preface it with a follow-up. I mean, from my experience, you can leverage the Open Athens Federation, so you don't have to, set up individual accounts with Uncommon for every SP. Plus, IP-based access is baked into that software, so you can manage all access points from one platform.
I've heard really good things about Open Athens. I don't have any personal experience with it, and we've never had it at Duke to my knowledge. And so I like to joke that Zhaneille is our Open Athens. But yeah, I'm glad to hear it has some good capacity for some real complexities. I think that's also one of our hesitations is just the level of complexity of the Duke Kunshan restrictions in particular.
Right.
I can answer a quick question. Johanna, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Yes, we have plural error pages. Yes, it is due to authorization. At least one will tell the patrons you have restricted access. You're not authorized to view this. Please reach out to Aztec.
Our ticketing system,
Our
yeah.
ticketing system.
And I did see there's a question in the chat about could you make those pages your specific sort of pages instead of getting the generic easy proxy message? Are those available?
I think we could probably link to them in either we can add them to our slides or a separate document that we can share.
Thanks.
I see that I was unmuted. This is Susan Davis at the University at Buffalo, where we've gone through a lot with authorization, access, etc. The pandemic shutdown really showed or helped the e-resources team shine, and that we were at least had heard of In Common in that, and we worked very hard to set that up, and we already understood about, you know, off-campus access, which now everybody was going to have. So we were well positioned in that role. So, but I can appreciate when you're new, what do you know? What, you know, broadly that is, you know, what do you tapped into your campus IT? But one of the interesting issues again is like, who is supposed to have access? What are the policies of your campus IT? As we were learning, like when students graduated, how long are they in the system? When staff leave, if they resign, they're supposed to be out in 30 days. If you retire, there's some other rules. We had alumni, as I put in the chat, we discovered some alumni in the Easy Proxy logs that had all these privileges that they were never supposed to have. And when we turned them off and they would, you know, get the "you're not authorized" notifications, they would write to us and explain why they're working with, you know, Professor so-and-so 7 years after they've graduated and they need these things. And then it's like, well, you have to go back to the department and get a different status because alumni don't have access to that, which again violates most of your license agreements. But at least in SUNY, there's a general big security push, and lots of former patron groups, not active people, are losing a number of privileges. So there is a bit of, you know, tension, but we have some stock, you know, language, and most people are good if they're helping with, let's say, with a professor. They can often get a volunteer or some kind of adjunct appointment that makes them, you know, real true users. And just to go back to the Open Athens discussion, I mean, we looked into it some as well, thinking it would help, but we have so many niche, and I imagine that Duke as well has many niche publishers. You still have to maintain some kind of IP-based access for them, where John, I mean, nothing against Coastal Carolina, but you may have some very specialized things, but perhaps not the breadth that a much larger institution would have. So those are just a few thoughts, but this is not, again, black and white. There's a lot of gray areas and a lot of work to handle it. So I'm delighted to see that you have these positions to work on it. Thanks.
Yeah, everything you've said is very relatable.
So we're really at the end of our time, but there's one last question that SAS sign-on affected counter usage stats. Could you explain?
Yeah, from Lady Jane. So SSO is focused on authentication. It doesn't really track user clicks after that, the way how IP Easy Proxy does. So there's that like loss of usage stat that universities, e-resources departments really need, because SSO is focused on authentication.
Yeah, and it's like it's a little unclear how it may or may not be incorporated from our perspective.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We are now going to have a break until 2:40.